The road into Bitter Creek stretched long and mean, the dirt churned up by wagon wheels and horse hooves until it felt less like a street and more like a scar cut across the land. Clara Whitmore walked it barefoot, every step pressing dust into the raw skin of her feet. The August sun bore down, turning the horizon into a wavering haze, and the shawl she clutched to her shoulders was more threads than cloth. It had been her mother's once, though it did little now against the dry wind that tugged it like it meant to take it away. The town rose ahead of her, a line of wooden buildings with paint long since peeled to gray. The saloon doors swung on their hinges, spilling the sharp tang of whiskey into the air. A blacksmith hammered somewhere down the street, each strike echoing like a reminder that she did not belong here, not with empty hands and a body worn down to nothing. She had no kin, no money, not even shoes, just the memory of a wagon gone to splinters, graves carved too shallow in the earth, and the silence that followed when she was the only one left standing. People noticed her the way they always noticed strays. Women paused on the boardwalk with baskets of flour and bolts of cloth, their whispers sharper than the cicadas buzzing in the grass. Men leaning against hitching posts looked her over once, then turned away, as if the sight of her might cling. A beggar, that's what they would call her, a burden before she'd even opened her mouth. Clara kept her chin lifted anyway, though her throat burned with thirst and her eyes stung from the dust. If she lowered her gaze, if she bent, then she was admitting defeat, and she had not walked this far to fall now. At the mercantile, she paused, drawn by the smell of bread still warm from the oven. She pushed the door open, its bell jangling against the stale air. The shopkeeper looked up from behind the counter, his mustache bristling with impatience before she'd even spoken. Clara set her jaw and asked if he might spare her a loaf, just until she found work. His answer was a flat no, his eyes sliding past her to the shelves as though she'd already taken too much by stepping inside. She didn't beg again. She stepped back into the sunlight, her hunger gnawing worse for having smelled what she couldn't touch. That was when she felt it, the weight of someone watching. Not the sidelong glances of gossiping townsfolk, but a gaze steadier, heavier. Across the street, a man stood in the shade of the livery barn. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, his coat clean and his boots polished, though the dust of the town clung to everyone else. His hat brim shadowed his eyes, but she could feel them on her all the same, dark and unflinching. Jacob Callahan. She didn't know his name then, not yet, but everyone in Bitter Creek did. The wealthy rancher who had struck luck early, who owned more land than most men would see in a lifetime, and who kept himself apart. He didn't waste words on anyone, didn't waste time either. But he didn't look away from her, not when the others whispered, not when she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, as if it might shield her from the whole town. Clara swallowed hard, the taste of dust and pride thick on her tongue. She was a woman with nothing left to bargain with but her own will. And yet, standing in that street with the townsfolk's stares cutting into her like knives, she thought for the first time since burying her parents that maybe someone saw her, not as a beggar, not as a burden, just as a soul still standing, barefoot in the dust, refusing to fall. And Jacob Callahan kept watching, silent as stone, like a man deciding something that would change them both. The sun had climbed higher by the time Clara stepped back out onto the mercantile's porch, the sound of the shopkeeper's dismissal still ringing in her ears. She felt the weight of eyes on her again, all the way down the boardwalk, murmurs of women who turned their backs as she passed, the sharp bark of laughter from men lounging outside the saloon. Her stomach was hollow, her feet burned from the splintered boards, and her pride was the only thing keeping her upright. She pulled her ragged shawl tighter and fixed her gaze on the dusty road, willing herself not to look broken. Bootsteps crossed the street behind her. She didn't hear them at first, only sensed the shift in the air, the way people suddenly fell quiet. Then the sound was right beside her, slow, deliberate, steady as the ticking of a clock. Clara lifted her head, and there he was. The man from the livery. The one who had been watching. Up close, Jacob Callahan looked even taller, his shadow stretching long across the sun-bleached boards. His hat brim kept his eyes hidden, but his mouth was set firm, his jaw carved as if from stone. He didn't speak at once, just studied her the way a rancher might study a horse he wasn't sure would stand. Clara stiffened, every muscle braced for some cutting remark. Instead, he turned, pushed open the mercantile door, and stepped inside. The bell above the frame jangled. Clara blinked after him, her breath caught. Moments later, he came back out, arms full. A small bundle wrapped in brown paper, a pair of worn but sturdy boots, and a coat folded over one hand. Without ceremony, he set them on the bench beside her. "Take 'em." His voice was low, gravel rasping in his throat like it had been shaped by smoke and hard whiskey. She stared at the boots, at the food wrapped neat as if it belonged to someone else. Her pride flared hot. "I didn't ask you for anything." "You didn't have to." He held her gaze finally, dark eyes steady beneath the brim of his hat. "You need them, and I got more than I can use." She hesitated, suspicion and shame twisting in her chest. Charity always came with a cost, she had learned that much already. Men who smiled kindly, only to snatch at what they thought was theirs to take. Families who promised help until she was too much of a burden. She opened her mouth to refuse. That was when he leaned in just enough that only she could hear. "You have me now." The words stopped her cold. They weren't spoken soft, not like comfort. They were delivered like fact, solid as fence posts, hammered into earth. And the way he said them, it wasn't pity, it was claim. Clara's throat tightened. She should have walked away, should have told him she didn't need saving. But her bare feet throbbed, her stomach clenched, and the stares of the townsfolk burned holes in her back. Slowly, she pulled the boots closer, sliding them onto her raw feet. They fit well enough. The coat came next, heavy and warm on her shoulders. She couldn't bring herself to thank him. Not yet. Jacob watched her a moment longer, then lifted the bundle of food into her hands. "Come on," he said. "You'll ride back with me." Her pulse jumped. "Where?" "My ranch." The word should have sent her running. Instead, she followed, because there was nowhere else left to go. He led her to a bay gelding hitched to the rail, swinging up into the saddle with the ease of long practice. He reached down a gloved hand toward her. Clara froze, staring at it, then at him. "I don't offer charity without reason," he said, voice even. "But you'll be safe under my roof." She set her jaw, slipped her hand into his, and let him pull her up behind him. His grip was firm, unyielding, and for the first time in months, she felt something other than fear gnawing at her bones. Not hope, not yet, but something steady, something that might hold. As the horse started forward and the town faded behind them, Clara looked once over her shoulder at the faces still whispering on the boardwalk. Let them talk. She had boots on her feet, food in her lap, and the coat of a man who had spoken as though she belonged to him already. "You have me now," he'd said. The words echoed in her chest, unsettling and dangerous. She didn't know yet if they were a promise or a threat, but she was desperate enough to find out. The Callahan Ranch rose from the hills like it had been carved straight out of the land itself. Wide pastures spread in every direction, a river cutting through the low ground, cattle scattered like dark coins against the gold of late summer grass. Clara sat stiff behind Jacob on the gelding, her fingers gripping the saddle horn as they crested the final ridge. She had never seen so much land belong to one man. It felt endless, the kind of place a soul could get lost in and never be found again. The house came into view at the edge of a cottonwood grove, its clapboard siding weathered but solid, windows glinting in the afternoon light. It was larger than she expected, 2 full stories with a wraparound porch and chimneys at either end, built not just for shelter but for permanence. Yet when Jacob swung down from the saddle and tied off the horse, the place felt empty, too still for its size. He led her inside without a word, boots thudding against the wooden floorboards. The air smelled faintly of pine resin and smoke, the kind of scent that clings when a fire burns low more nights than not. The front room was neat, sparse. A long table stretched near the hearth, but only one chair bore the wear of daily use. Dust lay thin across the others. Shelves stood half-filled, a few books, a carved box, a rifle propped in the corner. Jacob stopped at the foot of the staircase, his hat still in his hand. "You'll take the room at the back," he said, his voice even, practical. "Bed's clean. You need rest. You stay there as long as you like." Clara glanced up the staircase, her heart thudding. "And when I've rested? Then you decide what comes next." His gaze held hers for a moment before sliding away. "I don't keep strays, but I don't turn folks out hungry either." She wanted to ask what he expected in return, but the words stuck in her throat. She had learned too well what offers of kindness often cost. He must have read something of her suspicion, because his tone sharpened, not unkind but firm. "You owe me nothing," he said. "Not a word, not a debt. You'll stay put until you've got your feet under you, that's all." It should have been a comfort. Instead, it unsettled her more. Clara nodded, clutching the shawl tighter to her shoulders, though the weight of his coat still hung warm across them. The hours passed slow in that house. She unpacked nothing because she had nothing. She washed at the basin, changed into the spare dress he'd left folded on the bed, a plain calico, too big in the shoulders but whole, and that was more than she'd had in months. When the bell of the dinner triangle sounded from outside, she followed the smell of beans and cornbread into the kitchen. Jacob sat at the long table, head bowed slightly as though the day's work still pressed on his shoulders. He gestured to the chair opposite. No prayer was spoken, no words of welcome. Just the scrape of spoons against tin plates and the steady crackle of the fire. Clara ate slow, aware of every sound, the wind nudging the shutters, the creak of the floorboards as the house settled, the low rasp of his breathing. She stole glances at him, at the way his hands moved with quiet precision, at the scar along his forearm that disappeared beneath his shirt sleeve. He did not look like a man who sought company, but he had brought her here all the same. When her plate was half empty, she murmured, "Why me?" Jacob looked up, his dark eyes unreadable. For a long moment he didn't answer. Then he said simply, "Because you were still standing." The silence stretched again, but something had shifted in it. Not soft, not yet, but less hollow. Clara lowered her gaze to her plate, the food suddenly heavy in her mouth, and thought that maybe, just maybe, there was more to this man than the stern lines of his face and the gravel in his voice. Later, as she lay in the unfamiliar bed, the house groaned with emptiness around her. Yet beneath it, she heard the faintest sound of boots moving across the floor below, steady and measured, as if he walked the rooms each night to make sure the walls still held. It was not comfort, not love, but it was care, hidden deep in a man who had long learned to keep it quiet. And for the first time in months, Clara closed her eyes and slept without fear. The evening settled over Bitter Creek with a sky the color of rust, shadows stretching long across the Callahan Ranch. Clara sat by the hearth, her hands folded in her lap, staring at the flames as they licked and cracked against the logs. She had spent 2 nights in this house now, eating at a table that felt too large, sleeping in a bed too soft after months on the trail. Safety should have comforted her, but silence had a way of pulling old memories loose, and tonight they pressed against her until she could no longer hold them back. Jacob sat across from her, boots planted wide, a ledger open on the table, though he hadn't touched it in some time. His face was turned toward the fire, but she knew he was aware of her. He always was, somehow. He had that way about him still, watchful, as if he'd learned that listening told more than questions ever could. She drew a breath, the words scraping raw as they left her. "We came west with a wagon," she said softly. "My father, my mother, and me. We thought we'd found a chance land outside town, good soil, water close by. We paid for it with everything we had." Her voice caught, but she pushed on. 2 weeks out, near the Ridge Road, men came at night, ambushed us, took the horses, set fire to the wagon, My parents, they didn't get out. The fire popped, a spark leaping onto the hearthstone. She didn't flinch. She'd seen worse fire than this. Fire that ate through wood and canvas while her mother's voice faded beneath the roar. I buried them as best I could, she went on. Too shallow. The ground was stone, and I had only my hands. Then I walked. Her gaze drifted to the coat hanging by the door, his coat, given without hesitation. I thought if I could just make it here, I could hold on to what was ours. Jacob's eyes lifted to her then, steady, unreadable. The land, he said, not as a question but as a fact. She nodded. My father bought it fair, paper signed, money paid. But Edwin Barrow says it's his. Says he had a claim on it years back, and that the judge will see it his way. He's already sent men once. Burned the barn before I could even settle. Told me if I didn't leave, worse would come. Her voice shook, anger pushing through the grief. I've run too many times, Mr. Callahan. From fire, from hunger, from men like him. I don't want to run anymore. Jacob leaned back, the chair creaking beneath his weight. He studied her for a long while, his hands folded loosely across his chest, the lamplight catching in the hard lines of his face. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, certain. Men like Barrow don't stop unless someone makes them. Clara held his gaze, the truth of his words sinking deep. She had known it already. She had seen it in the smirk of Barrow's men, in the way they set flame and rode off laughing because they feared no consequence. But hearing it from Jacob, spoken as calm fact, steadied her in a way her own thoughts never had. What would you have me do? She whispered. His eyes didn't waver. Stand. But not alone. The words settled heavy between them. For the first time in months, Clara felt something other than fear threading through her chest. It wasn't hope, not yet. But it was the beginning of resolve, and it burned almost as fierce as the fire at her feet. She looked back into the flames, her jaw set. She would not run again. Not while she still had breath to fight. The morning broke sharp and cold, the kind of August day when the wind carried a warning of the winter to come. Clara had been on the porch gathering kindling when she saw them 3 riders cresting the rise beyond the pasture. Their coats were dust-stained, their horses restless, and even at a distance she recognized the swagger of men who weren't coming for talk but for intimidation. Her stomach knotted, but she stood still, the bundle of sticks clutched tight in her arms. The riders didn't slow as they reached the yard. One of them, a broad man with a scar running down his cheek, tipped his hat mockingly in her direction. Mrs. Whitmore, he drawled, using her maiden name like it was a curse. Edwin Barrow says you're squatting on his ground. Thought we'd deliver the reminder before the judge does. His eyes slid over her thin frame, down to the boots that Jacob had given her, and a smirk twisted his mouth. Be a shame if you didn't take the advice. Clara's throat tightened, but before she could speak, the sound of boots striking wood came from behind her. Jacob stepped out onto the porch, hat low, coat hanging open enough to show the revolver resting easy at his hip. His voice was calm even, but it carried steel in it. You've delivered your message. Now ride out. The scarred man's smirk faltered, though he tried to cover it with a scoff. This ain't your quarrel, Callahan. Jacob's eyes narrowed, dark as the storm clouds building over the ridge. She's under my roof. That makes it mine. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the restless stamping of horses. The men shifted in their saddles, measuring him, measuring the steadiness in his stance. Clara could feel it too, the way his presence filled the porch. Not loud, not blustering, just immovable as stone. After a long moment, the scarred man spit into the dirt and jerked his reins. We'll see how long you want to keep sheltering a problem that ain't yours. They wheeled their horses and rode off, the thunder of hooves fading into the hills. Only when the dust settled did Clara release the breath she'd been holding. Her arms trembled as she set the kindling down, her heart hammering so loud she swore he could hear it. Jacob didn't watch the riders go. He looked at her instead, his gaze steady. unflinching. "That won't be the last of them," he said. "I know," she whispered. He stepped down from the porch, closing the space between them. "You need to understand something. If you stand alone in this, you'll lose. Barrow's got the judge, he's got half the town afraid of him, and he's got men willing to do his bidding. You're just one woman with a deed in her hand. That's not enough." Her jaw tightened, anger sparking at his bluntness. "So what am I supposed to do? Walk away? Let him take everything my family bled for?" His expression didn't soften. "No. But if you stand as my wife, they'll think twice before pushing. The name Callahan carries weight Barrow can't brush aside." The words hit her like a blow. Marriage. She stared at him, searching for some hint of jest, but there was none. Jacob Callahan wasn't a man who wasted words. Her breath came quick, ragged. "I didn't come here looking for a husband," she said. "And I wasn't looking for a wife," he answered, voice level. "But the truth doesn't bend to what we want. It bends to what keeps you standing." She turned away, staring out across the pasture, the cattle moving like shadows against the hills. Marriage had always been a chain to her, a bargain struck at the cost of freedom. Yet as the wind pulled at her shawl and the memory of those riders clung like smoke, she knew he was right. Alone, she was a target. Alone, she had nothing but a piece of paper no one would honor. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. She wanted to resist, to spit the word no into the air and cling to her pride. But pride wouldn't keep the barn from burning again. Pride wouldn't stop Barrow's men from circling until they cornered her. Finally, she turned back to Jacob, her voice steady though her knees trembled. "If I say yes, this isn't for love." "No," he agreed. "It's for survival, for the land, for what you're owed, nothing more." Clara swallowed hard, her heart thudding in her chest. "Then so be it." He gave a single nod, as if sealing an agreement already understood. "We'll speak to the preacher before sundown." And just like that, the course of her life bent again not by choice, not by hope, but by necessity. She wasn't sure if she felt more like she'd been saved or sentenced. But as Jacob's steady gaze held hers, she knew one thing. She would not be facing Barrow alone. Not anymore. The church in Bitter Creek was little more than a wooden frame set on stone, its steeple leaning as though the wind had tried too many times to pull it down. The boards creaked underfoot when Jacob pushed the door open, the smell of dust and old hymnals heavy in the air. The preacher, a thin man with tired eyes, looked up from sweeping the aisle. His broom clattered to the floor when Jacob said, in that gravel-deep voice of his, "We need vows." Clara stood just behind him, her fingers twisted tight in the folds of her shawl. The preacher's gaze flicked between them, questions unspoken, but Jacob's expression was unyielding. After a moment, the old man nodded, shuffled toward the pulpit, and opened his Bible. Clara's heart thudded in her chest. She had imagined marriage once, back when her parents still dreamed aloud of futures that stretched farther than the horizon. But nothing of that dream remained here. No lace, no family, no warmth in the eyes of those watching. Only silence, broken by the shuffling of boots and the crackle of the oil lamps. They stood before the preacher as he cleared his throat and began the words. Clara lifted her chin, though her stomach churned. She heard the verses about honor and obedience, about binding until death, and each syllable pressed heavy on her shoulders. Her life had been shaped too often by other people's choices, and this felt like another chain, another road she hadn't chosen. And yet, beneath the weight of it, there was something steadier, a line being drawn between her and the world that sought to crush her. Jacob's voice cut through the hush when he spoke his vows. He didn't stumble, didn't soften. He said the words as if they were contracts, signed and sealed before heaven. When her turn came, Clara's throat closed. The words nearly stuck, but she forced them out, quiet but firm, her voice trembling only at the edges. "For better or worse, for richer or poorer," she repeated, though all she had ever known was the poorer, and worse had become her constant companion. The preacher closed the book, offered a blessing, and stepped back, his face drawn with something between pity and unease. There was no ring passed, no kiss to seal the union. Just silence, the echo of the vows hanging in the rafters, and the sound of her pulse in her ears. Jacob turned to her, his dark eyes steady, unreadable. "You're a Callahan now," he said, the words flat as stone. She swallowed, her mouth dry, unsure whether to feel relief or grief. They walked out into the fading light, the door swinging shut behind them. The street was empty, but Clara felt the weight of unseen eyes, the town already whispering about the woman who had walked in alone and walked out bound to the wealthiest man for miles. She felt trapped in that knowledge, her future tied to his without any promise of kindness. And yet, she also felt the faintest flicker of safety, like standing inside a wall built high enough to keep the wolves out. On the ride back to the ranch, Jacob was silent, the reins loose in his hands, the gelding's hooves steady against the road. When they reached the porch, he finally spoke, his voice low, deliberate. "This changes nothing about the house. You'll have your room, you'll live as you did yesterday, but you'll have my name, and that will carry weight." Clara met his gaze, her breath tight in her chest. She wanted to ask what he expected from her, what unspoken cost would come with the name Callahan, but the words would not leave her lips. She only nodded, clutching her shawl close as the wind stirred the dust around them. Inside, the house was as it had been before, quiet, too large for one man, too empty for two. Yet when she lay in her bed that night, the vows echoed in her ears. She was no longer Clara Whitmore, wandering and unseen. She was Clara Callahan, bound by words spoken before God. Trapped, yes. But for the first time in months, she felt the ground beneath her feet might hold. The wind rattled the shutters as night folded over the Callahan ranch. Clara had just banked the fire low when she heard the creak of the porch boards and the heavy thud of boots across the floor. She turned, startled, and the lamp's glow fell across Jacob's figure in the doorway. His coat hung open, one sleeve darkened with blood, his face drawn tight as though he'd walked miles on sheer will alone. Her breath caught. "Jacob." He waved a hand as if to dismiss her worry, but the motion was sluggish. "Fence dispute," he muttered, his voice rough. "Someone thinks I'm getting too close to the East Ridge." The words were simple, but the torn fabric and the way he held his arm told more. Clara was already moving, pulling a basin from the shelf, filling it with water that steamed faintly in the cool air. She set it on the table, then reached for the cloth she'd been mending. "Sit," she ordered, her tone sharper than she meant. Jacob hesitated, then lowered himself into the chair with a grunt. The lamplight fell across his face, catching the streak of dust on his jaw, the lines around his eyes carved deep by years of sun and solitude. Clara knelt beside him, her hands steady even as her heart pounded. She tore the sleeve wider, exposing the gash along his arm, crimson against the muscle of his forearm. The water turned pink as she cleaned the wound. He didn't flinch, though his jaw tightened. His gaze stayed on her face, steady, measuring, while her fingers moved with care, brushing his skin. The room was silent save for the crackle of the fire and the faint hiss of water against torn flesh. "You shouldn't get involved in my troubles," he said at last, his voice quieter, almost weary. Clara glanced up, meeting his dark eyes. "You married me. I didn't marry you for this." Her hands paused, cloth hovering above the wound. "Then why did you?" He didn't answer. The silence between them thickened, heavy with things unsaid. She wrapped the bandage firm, tying it with a knot that would hold against whatever work tomorrow brought. When she leaned back, her knees ached from the floor, but she didn't rise. She stayed there, close enough to feel the heat of him. Later, when the children were asleep and the house had settled into its restless quiet, Clara found him again on the porch. The night air was cool, stars scattered wide above the ridge, the sound of crickets carrying across the fields. Jacob stood with his good hand braced on the railing, his wounded arm hanging stiff at his side. She joined him without a word, her shawl pulled tight, the hem brushing against the boards. For a long time they simply stood together, the silence no longer hollow but thick with something unspoken. Finally, Jacob's voice broke it, low and rough. "I never thought I'd have someone under this roof again." Clara's throat tightened. She turned her face toward him, the lamplight spilling faint across his profile, hard and worn but softened by the admission. "I never thought I'd stop running." The words hung between them, fragile as glass yet solid as truth. His gaze met hers, steady, unwavering. He didn't reach for her, didn't step closer, but something shifted all the same, something that felt like the ground beneath them was no longer so uncertain. They stood like that until the night grew colder and the stars wheeled higher. Two souls who had lived too long with silence, finding in each other a closeness neither had thought possible. And for Clara, for the first time since she had buried her parents beneath the stone-hard earth, the thought of staying no longer felt like surrender. It felt like the start of something she hadn't dared name, something that might one day feel like home. The courthouse in Bitter Creek was little more than a square box of timber with a bell that cracked each hour like a gunshot. On the morning of the hearing, Clara walked up its steps with her head held high, though her stomach churned with dread. The air inside was close, heavy with dust and sweat, as though every man packed into the benches had brought the whole prairie with him. She could feel their eyes on her, some curious, some cold, all waiting to see if a widow with nothing but a deed in her hand could stand against a man like Edwin Barrow. Jacob walked beside her, his long stride steady, his presence filling the room in a way no whisper could undermine. He didn't speak, didn't offer comfort, but the nearness of him was its own kind of shield. Clara gripped the folded paper in her hands so tightly the edges cut into her skin. It was all she had left of her father's dream, ink faded, signatures smudged, but real, hers, undeniable. Barrow sat across the aisle, his bulk spilling out of the chair, his black coat pressed and polished, as though wealth alone could sway the judge. His men crowded the benches behind him, broad-shouldered ranch hands and slick-tongued traders, each one wearing the smirk of someone who believed the verdict had already been bought. Clara's throat dried, but she forced her eyes forward, fixed on the desk where the county judge fanned himself lazily with a folded paper. When the hearing began, Barrow's lawyer wasted no time. He spoke of claims filed years earlier, of influence and standing, his words dripping with practiced authority. He held up a forged deed, edges crisp, ink too fresh to be anything but false, and handed it across the desk with a flourish. Clara felt the weight of doubt press against her shoulders, the murmurs of the crowd swelling like a tide. Her turn came. She rose, legs trembling beneath her calico dress, and placed her father's deed on the desk. Her voice quavered at first, but steadied as she went on, speaking of money exchanged, of promises made and sealed, of land walked and worked by her parents until their last breath. She told it plain, without polish, her words carrying the raw edge of truth that no lawyer's tongue could coat. Through it all, Jacob stood silent at her side, his hat in his hands, his presence like a wall. When she faltered, she felt his nearness steady her. When the murmurs grew, one glance at him was enough to remind her she was not standing there alone. The judge leaned back, eyes sliding between the two deeds. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint creak of the benches as men shifted impatiently. At last, he cleared his throat and spoke. "This court finds in favor of Mrs. Clara Callahan. The land in question belongs by right and purchase to her." The room erupted. Some cursed, others muttered about fairness and fraud, but Clara heard none of it. Her knees nearly gave way with the rush of relief, and only Jacob's hand, firm on her elbow, kept her upright. Barrow's face flushed red, his mouth twisted in fury, but he said nothing as the gavel struck the desk. Outside, the sunlight hit them hard, the dust of the street swirling in little devils around their boots. Clara clutched the deed against her chest, her breath coming fast, but for the first time in months, hope burned in her veins. She turned to Jacob, ready to thank him. but his face was hard, his eyes fixed on the horizon where Barrow's men lingered in the distance. "Don't fool yourself," he said, voice low and rough. "Winning the law don't mean winning the fight. Barrow won't stop here." Clara swallowed, her joy tempered by the warning. She knew he was right. The paper in her hands was a victory, but paper burned easy, and men like Edwin Barrow didn't yield without drawing blood. Still, as she looked at Jacob beside her, steady as the earth itself, she felt something stronger than fear. For the first time since her wagon burned, she believed she might not face what came next alone. The first snow came sudden, rolling down from the high ridges in a storm that buried the fields and turned the creek to glass. Clara woke that morning to a house wrapped in silence, the kind only snow could bring. Frost clung to the window panes in delicate veins, and the air bit at her skin even beneath the quilt. She dressed quickly, layering the coat Jacob had given her over her calico dress, and stepped into a world transformed. The ranch no longer felt like wide pastures and open sky. It was fenced in by white, each corral half swallowed, the barn roof sagging under the weight of snow. Jacob was already outside, axe in hand, splitting wood with measured swings. His breath puffed in clouds, his movements steady, tireless. Clara pulled her shawl tighter and crossed the yard, boots crunching into the drifts. Without a word, he handed her a bundle of logs to carry inside. It was the first task of many that day. The rhythm of life in winter was different, slower but no less demanding. Together they mended fences bent by the storm, their gloves stiff with ice, their bodies pressed against the wind. Clara fed the cattle, scattering hay while Jacob broke the ice from the troughs. She learned the care of horses, the heft of a saddle, the way to walk steady across frozen ground. Inside, she managed the hearth, stretched flour into biscuits, and patched the worn clothes that had to last through spring. The days were harsh, but the nights belonged to quiet. When the work was done and the lamps lit, Clara sat by the fire stitching while Jacob whittled scraps of wood into small shapes, birds, horses, pieces that filled the silence without needing words. The children's laughter filled the house again, Vera reading aloud, while Virgil clutched the wooden horse Jacob had carved for him. It was not a life of ease, but it was steady, and steadiness felt like a kind of grace. Weeks passed this way, snow piling high, winds rattling against the shutters. The house grew warmer in small ways, not from the fire alone, but from the rhythm they fell into, side by side, without quarrel or complaint. Jacob began to linger longer at supper, his eyes softening when Clara refilled his plate. He spoke more, not of grand things, but of fences, herds, weather, the kind of talk that carried weight because it was offered to her and no one else. One night, when the storm outside howled like a living thing and the fire roared against it, Clara sat close to the hearth, her sewing in her lap. Jacob set his knife down, the half-carved bird forgotten, and leaned back in his chair. His eyes met hers, steady and dark in the lamplight. "I didn't marry you for love," he said, the words blunt, but softened by something unspoken. "But I won't lie, it feels a lot like it now." The air between them seemed to still. Clara's breath caught, her heart pressing against her ribs with a force she hadn't expected. Slowly, she set aside her stitching and reached across the small space between them. Her hand found his, calloused and warm, resting on the arm of the chair. For a moment she hesitated, waiting for him to pull away as men so often did when tenderness asked more than they were willing to give. But Jacob's hand closed around hers, firm, sure, as if it had been meant to all along. They sat like that, the fire crackling, the storm beating useless against the walls, their hands joined in a silence that no longer felt empty. Clara looked at him and saw not just the stern rancher who had given her his name for survival, but the man who had split wood before dawn, carved toys for her children, and stood beside her in a courthouse filled with enemies. She had thought she would never stop running, but here, in this moment, she realized she already had. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, something else was taking root, steady and quiet, but strong enough to last through any winter. The thaw came slow, the snow retreating into muddy ruts and swollen streams. Spring should have felt like relief, but Clara sensed a heaviness in the air, a tension that settled across the ranch like a storm waiting to break. Jacob felt it too. He rode the fence lines more often, his revolver never far, his gaze sharper when strangers passed along the ridge. They both knew Barrow wouldn't let the winter's silence be mistaken for surrender. It was near sundown when the final test came. Clara was in the yard gathering laundry from the line, the wind snapping the damp sheets, when she heard the distant pounding of hooves. 3 riders appeared first, then 4 more, their horses charging across the open pasture like a dark wave. Dust kicked up behind them, their shouts carrying sharp against the wind. Clara froze, her breath caught, until Jacob's voice cut across the yard. "Inside, Clara." She turned to argue, but the look in his eyes stopped her. He was already striding toward the barn, rifle slung across his shoulder, every step measured, steady. Clara grabbed Vera and Virgil, ushering them into the house. She barred the door and pressed the children into the back room, whispering assurances she wasn't sure she believed. Then she went to the window, her heart in her throat. Barrow himself led the riders, his black coat snapping behind him, his face twisted with the kind of anger only men drunk on power carried. He reined his horse hard at the gate, shouting for Jacob to turn her out before worse came of it. The other men fanned wide, hands hovering near their guns. Jacob stood alone in the yard, hat brim low, rifle resting easy in his arms. His voice carried without strain, calm as stone. "She's my wife. This is her land. You ride off now, or you'll ride off worse." For a moment it seemed the world held still, the cattle in the distance, the wind against the porch, even Clara's own breath. Then Barrow cursed, spat into the dirt, and motioned his men forward. But Jacob didn't flinch. He raised the rifle, the barrel glinting in the last light of day. The set of his shoulders, the weight in his voice, made clear he wasn't bluffing. The standoff stretched, long and brittle. Finally, one of Barrow's men muttered something under his breath, yanked his reins, and wheeled away. Another followed, then another. The spell broke, leaving Barrow glaring from the saddle, his fury sharp enough to cut. But even he must have seen it then. Jacob Callahan would not yield, and no number of hired hands could make him. With a final curse, he spun his horse and thundered back across the field, his men trailing like shadows. Clara's knees gave way with the release of fear. She clutched the window frame, chest heaving, until Jacob came back across the yard. His rifle hung easy again at his side, but his eyes found hers through the glass, steady, certain. At dusk they stood together on the porch, the children safe inside, the land stretching quiet around them. The sky burned with the last of the sunset, soft gold fading into purple. Jacob rested his hand against the post, his voice low but sure. "You had nothing when you walked into Bitter Creek. Now you have this land, this home, and me. That's all I can give, but it's everything I've got." Clara's throat tightened, tears pricking hot at her eyes. She turned toward him, searching his face, and for the first time she believed it every word. She had thought herself trapped by necessity, bound by a name not her own, but standing there she felt something else entirely. Not grand, not storybook, but steady. She slipped her hand into his, fingers lacing with his as naturally as if they had always belonged there. The porch was quiet, except for the creak of wood beneath their weight, the world beyond holding its breath. And in that moment Clara knew whatever trials lay ahead, whatever storms or men like Barrow might come, she had found the one place she no longer needed to run from. It was home. Built not by chance but by choosing, again and again, day after day. And she would keep choosing it for the land, for the children, for the man beside her who had given her more than survival. He had given her a life.